Sir Mark Prescott, after 45 years at historic Heath House, now Newmarket's longest-serving trainer, saddling more than 1,900 winners. Meticulous in his shrewd race planning, plots and placing of horses, renowned as a strict disciplinarian, along with his loyalty to staff, having employed just 3 jockeys as the stables retained number 1. A national and amateur rider, he broke his back when 17 in a fall at Y racecourse and was hospitalised for 18 months before spells as assistant trainer. A champion of all field sports and bullfighting, teetotal, raconteur, mesmerising after-dinner speaker, and one of racing's deepest thinkers. Sir Mark, welcome to King for a Day. If you were the sports dictator, what reforms and innovations would you introduce?
Well, I've always kept strictly out of racing politics, so I'd confine myself really, I suppose, to something I like to think I know about, which is sort of training horses and the horse side of things. I think my principal gripe at the moment is the current whip rule, whereby it is the only rule, the breaking of which can win you a race, but cannot result in your horse losing the race. And I think that's absurd. So I would champion that the authorities have 5, you're allowed 5 cracks, or you're allowed 6 or 7, or whatever they think. That's fine by me. And if you go 1 over, you lose the race.
You go back, though, to racing without hitting horses. You run horses in the hands and heels apprentice races. You've no qualms about that?
But I run a certain sort of horse that will run for a weak rider, a horse who does 90% of it on his own. By definition, those are the horses that you run in amateur races and apprentice races, horses which will quicken up easily, and they probably go just as fast, whether they've got a jockey with a stick or not. But the majority of horses don't fall into that category, nor do we want them to. Those very free running horses that run on their nerves are not what we're trying to develop. We're trying to develop a horse who'll pick up when he's asked to pick up and will relax beforehand. So I think your rule, whilst it sounds a nice idea, no whips, and I can fully understand it.
Just for hitting horses, keeping for steering?
Yeah, whilst it sounds a nice idea, it results in 2 things. It results in human beings stirring the horses up before the race, and it results in an undesirable type of free-running horse coming to the fore, which is not what we want for the breed. So, no, I think your idea is good. It sounds good, but I don't think it would work.
Now, you're renowned for placing horses, a master of the form book, getting them well handicapped. How could the handicapping rules be changed? So much has changed down the decades that you've been a trainer, and now it seems very much that in the old days, for instance, horses were handicapped in the north and the south, and there was no sort of set central pattern. What would you do to change and alter the handicapping system that we have now?
Well, in the old days, there was a wonderful period when, of course, the handicappers handicapped the meeting. So you knew that Mr. Hancock was going to handicap Bath, you knew that Mr. Price was going to handicap Pontefract, and it was a wonderful time for a diligent trainer, because in the spring of the year you'd enter your horse with all 7 handicappers. One of them, of course, would have him much lower than the others, and then you'd follow him round or wait till there was sort of a sequence of races that he was handicapping, and you could tell your owner 2 months in advance that this horse was off, would be off like a bullet in the middle of August at Bath, Pontefract and Carlisle. So it was fun, but and it favoured somebody who really worked hard. Once we got centralised handicapping, things changed, and it became very, very important, the initial rating that a horse got. And all the more important because handicappers tend to put up horses quite quickly. Normally, if you win an average race, your horse will go up 5, whatever happens. And they tend to drop them very slowly. And this means that the initial rating a horse gets often controls his career. Now, if I was king for a day, I would encourage the handicappers to raise them as much as they do now. That's absolutely their prerogative, but to drop them much more quickly. So instead of dropping them £1 or £2 and this and that and the other, if a horse is transparently not running up to his rating, I'd drop him just as quickly as I would raise them. This would mean that the trainers would have more confidence that if the initial rating was to be proved wrong, in the case of particularly being too high, in a matter of a couple of runs, the horse would reach a level at which he was competitive. This would give trainers confidence. I think your maiden races would be more competitive as a result, because the trainer would think to himself, well, if he goes in £8 or £9 too high, a couple of runs will see him right anyway. So I think it would make for more exciting racing, certainly for the pundits and for the punters, because the weight ranges and changes would be more. And I think it would result in more competitive maiden races if the horse's initial rating would be seen to change more quickly. So I'd encourage the handicappers to be more broad brush.
Should there be a more formal system where trainers could complain to handicappers? Now it's sort of a nudge and a wink and, oh boy, this is a bit high in that weight. So
yes.
Should there be a formal system? If you were king for the day, would you say, right, trainers can complain? Because when they complain, very often the horses win, despite them being on a high mark.
Well, we never think they're well handicapped unless they win 3 lengths. And the handicapper never thinks it's well handicapped unless in his mind it can't win. That's where we start from. And there was a famous story about Admiral Rouse, who was the first great handicapper, and he went up into the stands for an 8-horse race at Newmarket, looking very pleased with himself. And some old girl said, "Now then, Admiral, you look very pleased with yourself. You look in very good form." And he said, "Yes, I've been through this race very carefully. There are 8 runners, and none of them can win." And so handicappers, traditionally, they're wanting to stop them winning, and trainers are always thinking they should win 3 or 4 lengths to be well handicapped. So there's this dichotomy between us, but I think I would allow them more freedom.
Would you try, as king for the day and not as a trainer, to prevent the plotting of horses and trying to get their weight down? And is there cheating involved? Or if you run behind a very good horse who turns out to be a grade group 1 or 2 horse in a maiden, you're therefore raised far too high for the rest of your career? What sort of plotting and scheming goes on?
Well, you've got to be very careful in a horse's initial runs, as we've just discussed. And there was a famous median auction race at Ayr where for 2-year-olds, median auction probably saw average price less than 12,000 or something. And in this very famous race, the Prix du Jockey Club winner beat the gimcrack winner. And presumably the trainer of the third committed suicide on his way home because what he thought was a very nice 2-year-old had beaten half the track, and Celtic Swing had just beaten Chilly Billy. So, you know, God knows how that poor horse got rated that finished third. So if the handicappers don't reduce ratings as quickly as they raise them, I think you'll always get this problem that maiden races won't be as competitive as they should be.
One of the public perceptions of racing now are the starts. The Grand National is obviously a prime example of that. But time and again there are sort of false starts and things going wrong at the start. What as dictator would you bring in to try and ensure, you never will completely, but try and ensure fairer, more level starts? Obviously National Hunt Racing benefits most in this.
Well, in the field of National Hunt Racing, I really would be the king and dictator for the day, and I would give the authority back to the starters. And the starters have been undermined systematically ever since poor Mr. Brown was virtually fired and certainly laughed out of existence for the Grand National fiasco start that was absolutely nothing to do with his fault whatsoever. And from then on, the press, to a degree, have hounded the starters, complaining about a false start. You've got to have a false start if somebody's not got an equal start. That's what it's about. So the press are a bit to blame, and the authorities certainly. And I would give the starters back real authority. If you look at those old 1930s films of Barham's Derby and things, they started absolutely as much in a line as if they'd come out of stalls. Why? Because Alec Marsh and those people were absolute dictators, and they could give jockeys a day off here and a day off there.
The starters themselves gave the penalties.
In those days, you see. Now, I mean, I don't suppose we're going to do that now, but the starter ought to have complete authority, and if the jockey won't take the horse back, he should be reported to the stewards and straight away given 2 or 3 days off. You've got to stick up for the starters. If the jockeys knew that the starters couldn't be blackmailed, if the jockeys knew that the starter meant what he said, then they would obey the start and you would get proper starts. As it is now, because the starter is afraid of the press saying there were 2 false starts at Cheltenham, but they feel that they can lean on the starter and they can probably force him to let them go. As a result, the jockeys are all feeling less confident. They're all thinking so-and-so's getting an edge on me, and you get your full start like we had in this year's Grand National, because everybody's terrified that even though it's not much of a line, he is going to let them go.
But you go back to the good old days and say how wonderful they were, but surely there was they were looking after Sir Gordon Richards. As long as Sir Gordon got away,
oh, yeah, well,
their starters didn't bother.
That's right. But if you look at those old films, the starts were, undoubtedly, the tape starts were much better than they are now. And I'm sure that's because the starters had complete authority, and I'm sure that's because the jockeys knew that he couldn't be blackmailed, he couldn't be intimidated, and therefore, in the end, it was better for the jockeys. Funnily enough, the proper rules being enforced, in the end, makes it easier for the jockeys.